Number 10. Aileen Whornos. Aileen Whornos was an American serial killer and prostitute who operated in Florida. In 1989 to 1990, while engaging in street prostitution along highways, she shot dead and robbed 7 of her male clients. She claimed that her clients had either taken advantage of or tried to take advantage of her, and that all the deaths were committed in self-defense. Aileen was sentenced to death for 6 of the deaths, and on October 9, 2002, after 12 years on Florida's death row, she was executed by lethal injection. Her last words were, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th. Like the movie Big Mothership and all, I'll be back." Number 9. Robert Charles Towery. Robert Charles Towery ended the life of Robert Jones, a philanthropist who loaned money to him on several occasions and used him as a mechanic. Robert Jones was in his home when Robert Towery asked him to use his phone. Once inside, he pulled a weapon on him and handcuffed him. He then proceeded to take $1,200 and load jewelry, electronics, and other items into his car before he led his victim to the master bedroom at gunpoint. He laid the victim face down on the bed and injected him using a veterinary syringe filled with battery acid. He told the victim the substance would put him to sleep, but he passed away. Robert was arrested and put on death row in Arizona. On March 8, 2012, he was put to death by lethal injection. During Robert's last moments, he apologized to the victim's family and cursed his bad mistakes. His last words were, "I love my family, potato, potato, potato." The potato reference was a secret message to his nephew. Apparently, it's the sound that a Harley-Davidson motorcycle makes when the engine is idle, and it was a way of saying that everything is okay, or was it? I don't know. Number 8. Grover Cleveland Redding. Grover Cleveland Redding believed he was the Prince of Abyssinia and was on a mission to bring his people back to the homeland. He started an anti-government riot, and at some point the Abyssinians started burning US flags. 2 white cops approached them, but the Abyssinians were armed and chased them off. A black cop approached them and he was shot. One Abyssinian burned a flag and quoted it, shouting the following, "As we have destroyed these flags, we are going to destroy your government. Our government is backing us." This provoked the calling of every Southside police district to send 20 men and a commanding officer to the protest. Allegedly, 700 policemen responded in 20 minutes. They stopped the Abyssinians before any more violence. All participants were arrested within a week, and Grover was sentenced to death for starting an anti-government riot in which 2 of his followers were killed. He was hanged, and his last words were, "I have something to say, but not at this time." And I guess we'll never know. Number 7. Thomas Grasso. On December 24, 1990, Thomas Grasso strangled Hilda Johnson using her Christmas tree lights in her Tulsa home. He stole $8 from her purse, $4 in loose change, and her television set, which he sold for $125. 6 months later, after moving to New York, he ended the life of Leslie Holtz, a man from Staten Island, on July 4, 1991, and stole his security check. New York detectives investigating the death of Leslie arrested Thomas, and within 2 weeks he had confessed to the police. He first told investigators about the Staten Island killing and then about the death of Hilda Johnson. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 20 years to life on April 21, 1992 for the death of Leslie, and on September 28, 1992 he pleaded guilty to the death of Hilda and was sentenced to death in Oklahoma. Although his last meal included 4 dozen steamed mussels and clams, a Burger King double cheeseburger, a half dozen barbecue spare ribs, and 2 strawberry milkshakes, he was disappointed that they substituted spaghetti for SpaghettiOs. Due to this, his final words were, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs, I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." Now, not that this is scary necessarily, but you gotta admit, it's messed up. It was his last meal ever and they didn't provide it to him. Number 6. Tom Blackjack Ketchum. Tom Blackjack Ketchum was an American cowboy who later became an outlaw. Blackjack and a group of others were named as robbers of a railway train in 1892 with a large payroll aboard. The second major crime attributed to Blackjack was the death of a neighbor, John N. It's alleged that he was also involved in the disappearance and presumed deaths of Albert Jennings Fountaine and his son Henry Fountaine in early June 1896. Then Blackjack and his brother Sam, and possibly others, robbed a combined convenience store and post office. On July 11, 1899, the gang, without Blackjack, robbed a train again at Twin Mountain, and on August 16, 1899, Blackjack, supposedly knowing nothing about the July 11th holdup, single-handedly attempted to rob the same train again at the same place and in the same way that he and Sam and others had robbed it just a few weeks earlier. He was arrested, and at the trial he was convicted of attempted train robbery and sentenced to death. He was hanged, and his last words were, "I'll be in hell before you start breakfast." Ironically though, the hanging was botched, with the noose ripping his head clean off when the trap door was retracted. It was said that his body landed with both feet on the ground and remained upright for a short time after. Number 5. Peter Kürten. Peter Kürten was a German man known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf who took the lives and took advantage of many people between February and November 1929 in the city of Dusseldorf. The first death he definitely committed occurred on May 25, 1913. During the course of a burglary, he encountered a girl named Christine Klein asleep in her bed. Peter strangled her, then slashed her twice across the throat with a pocket knife, and this made him excited down there, if you know what I mean, due to him hearing the blood dripping from her wounds onto the floor by her bed and on his hand. He then did this multiple times to countless other victims. Then one day Peter confessed to his wife that he was the Vampire of Dusseldorf. In information provided to detectives, his wife explained although she knew her husband had been repeatedly imprisoned in the past, she was unaware of his culpability in any deaths. He was arrested and was charged with 9 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity to each of the charges, but he was found guilty and sentenced to death on 9 counts, and he was also found guilty on 7 counts of attempted murder. Peter displayed no emotion as the sentence was passed, and at 6 o'clock in the morning of July 2nd, 1931, Peter was beheaded via guillotine. Since he loved blood, his last words were, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be a pleasure to end all pleasures." Number 4. Georges Jacques Danton. Georges Jacques Danton was a French lawyer and leading figure in the French Revolution. In August 1792, he became the French Minister of Justice and was responsible for inciting the September massacres. In spring 1793, he supported the foundation of Revolutionary Tribunal and became the first president of the Committee of Public Safety. Georges was a key figure in the case of Duamoris. In early October 1793, he left politics but was urged to return to Paris to plead as a moderate for an end to the terror. His continual criticism of the Committee of Public Safety provoked further counterattacks. At the end of March 1794, he made a speech announcing the end of the terror. Within a week, he became embroiled in a scandal concerning the bankruptcy proceedings of the French East India Company and was guillotined by the advocates of the revolutionary terror after accusations of conspiracy towards the enemies of the revolution. On March 30th, the 2 committees decided to arrest him and he was sentenced to death. He was one member of a group of 15 people beheaded on April 5th, 1794. His last words spoken to his executioner were, "Don't forget to show my head to the people, it's well worth seeing." Number 3. Joachim von Ribbentrop. Joachim von Ribbentrop was a German politician and diplomat who served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1938 to 1945. He became a close confidant of the dictator running Germany at the time, to the disgust of many party members who thought him superficial and lacking talent. He was appointed ambassador to the Court of St. James, the Royal Court of the United Kingdom in 1936, and then Foreign Minister of Germany in February 1938. He did the utmost to support a declaration of war on the United States after the attack on Pearl Harbor and helped facilitate Japan's decision to attack the United States in 1941. He was arrested in June 1945 and was convicted and sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trials for his role in starting World War II in Europe and enabling the death of Jewish people. On October 16, 1946, he became the first Nuremberg defendant to be executed by hanging. He reportedly turned to Henry F. Grecki, the prisoner's Lutheran chaplain, before the hood was placed over his head and whispered, "I'll see you again." Number 2. Karl Panzram. Karl Panzram was a killer, arsonist, burglar, and someone who took advantage of men. In prison confessions and in his autobiography, he confessed to having committed 21 deaths, only 5 of which could be corroborated. He is suspected of ending the lives of more than 100 men in the United States States alone and several more in Portuguese Angola. He also confessed to having committed more than 1,000 acts of taking advantage to men. His last words were, "In my lifetime, I have murdered 22 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I've committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all those things, I am not in the least bit sorry." Now, that is just plain disturbing. He had no remorse at all, and it seems like he confessed to an extra death. And coming in at number 1 is Jake Bird. In 1949, Jake Bird, sometimes referred to as the Tacoma Axe Killer, was arrested by police after breaking into the home of Bertha Klutt and her daughter Beverly June Klutt and ending their lives with an axe. Upon questioning by authorities, Jake revealed intimate knowledge of 33 other deaths of Caucasian women, which made him a prime suspect in those as well. On July 15, 1949, he was hanged at the Washington State Penitentiary, but not before he uttered what would be later known as the Bird Hex in his final statement. He said, "I'm putting the Jake Bird Hex on all of you who had anything to do with me being punished. Mark my words, you will die before I do." Now, the real scary thing about this though is within a year of his execution, 6 people connected to his case did die. So is it a curse? Was it a coincidence? Who knows?
Starting off this countdown, we have Jeffrey Dahmer. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this infamous serial killer. Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee or the Milwaukee Monster, was an American serial killer who murdered and dismembered 17 men from 1878 to 1991. He would pack the victims' body parts into plastic bags and bury them behind his parents' home. Upon searching his home, police found albums full of pictures of body parts, and his place was filled with human remains. Heads were in the fridge and freezer, 2 skulls were on display, and a 57-gallon drum filled with decomposing bodies was found in his room. On top of that, there was evidence that Dahmer would eat some of his victims. On November 28, 1994, he was beaten to death by an inmate. His last words were, "I don't care if I live or die. Go ahead and kill me." Moving on at number 9, we have Robert Alton Harris. Robert Alton Harris was an American kidnapper, thief, and murderer. He was convicted for the murder of 2 boys in San Diego. On April 21st, 1992, he was sentenced to death via gas chamber. But first, let's talk about his last meal. This guy went all out. He had KFC, 2 large pizzas, a bag of jelly beans, and a 6-pack of Pepsi. Now, his last words were, "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everyone dances with the Grim Reaper." This is actually a misquote from the 1991 film Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. Nonetheless, pretty creepy. Making our way down the list at number 8, we have Clarence Ray Allen. Clarence Ray Allen was an American criminal who played a role in killing 3 people. In 1974, Clarence was on trial for the murder of his son's girlfriend. He had 8 witnesses testify against him. And guess what? He hired a hitman to kill those witnesses. The hitman successfully killed 3 of them and then was caught and turned Clarence in. Clarence died by lethal injection on January 17, 2006. His last words were, "Hoka hey, it's a good day to die. Thank you very much, I love you all, goodbye." Wow. In our 7th spot, we have Aileen Whornos. Aileen Whornos, often referred to as the Damsel of Death, killed 7 men. She murdered them, robbed them, and then drove home in their cars. Due to this, she was named America's first female serial killer. Now, she does claim that it was all self-defense and that they tried to assault her, but her stories of the events were very inconsistent. In fact, during an interview with a filmmaker, she claims that it was self-defense, but that she couldn't stand being on death row any longer since she had already been there for 10 years, and she just wanted to die, so that's why she confessed to killing the men. On October 9th, 2002, she was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Her last words were a reference from the movie Independence Day. She said, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie Big Mothership and all, I'll be back." Now, people often cut this quote down and say that her last words were just, "I'll be back," but either way, it's pretty creepy and kind of like the Terminator, like, "I'll be back." Moving on at number 6, we have Andre Chikatilo. Andre Chikatilo was a serial killer that confessed to murdering over 50 women. The murders took place from 1978 to 1990. In fact, he's been deemed one of history's sickest serial killers. On February 14th, 1994, he was executed by a gunshot to the head. Just before his death, he said, "Don't blow my brains out, the Japanese want to buy them." And then he was shot and killed. We are now at our fifth and halfway mark with Carl Panzram. Charles, or Carl Panzram, was an American serial killer, robber, and arsonist. He claims to have murdered 22 individuals. However, only a handful of them have been proved. In his autobiography that he wrote in prison, he also states that he committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, and arsons. On September 5th, 1930, at the age of 39, Carl was killed by being hung. His last words were, "Hurry up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill 10 men while you're fooling around." In our fourth spot, we have H.H. Holmes. Hermer Webster Mudgett, otherwise known as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, or H.H. Holmes, was an American serial killer. In 1886, he moved to Chicago and got a job as a pharmacist under the name Dr. H.H. Holmes. However, he was killing people in order to steal their properties. He also got his employees to write him down as a beneficiary so that he would get all the money after he killed them. And then he would sell the bodies of his victims to medical schools. On top of that, he owned a house that was referred to as the Murder Castle. Basically, his home had secret passages, trapdoors, soundproof rooms, gas chambers, and a kiln to cremate the bodies. Eventually, he admitted to 27 murders. However, only 9 were confirmed. Yet, officials believe he had killed closer to 200 individuals. On May 7th, 1896, he was hung. His last words were, "Take your time, don't bungle it." Moving on to number 3, we have George Engel. George Engel was an anarchist and con artist. He was thought to be involved in the 1886 bombing in Haymarket Square. Although the night of the bombing, Engel was home, he was arrested and charged with conspiracy in the bombing. He was hung on November 11th, 1887. Just before being hung, he said, "Hurrah for anarchy! This is the happiest moment of my life." In our second spot, we have Tom Ketchum. Tom Ketchum, otherwise known as Black Jack, was a famous cowboy that later turned into an outlaw. He committed several robberies and crimes. In 1901, he was caught after a failed train robbery. Looks like they did catch him. Get it? I know, it's bad. While attempting to rob the train, he was shot in the arm and later captured by the police. On April 26, 1901, he was sentenced to death by hanging. His last words were, "I'll be in hell before you start breakfast, boys. Let her rip." Pretty scary. But that's not the worst part. Apparently, the hanging didn't go according to plan. The night before, the executioner tested the rope with a 200-pound sandbag, but then forgot to remove it. So when they went to hang Ketchum, this caused his entire head to just be decapitated. His body then fell to the floor and apparently remained upright on its feet for quite some time. And in our number 1 spot, we have the Dusseldorf Vampire. Peter Kürten, also known as the Dusseldorf Vampire or the Dusseldorf Monster, was a German serial killer. He was responsible for the deaths of around 60 people. And in one case, he actually drank the blood of one of his victims. Hence why they call him the vampire. On July 2nd, 1931, Peter was sentenced to death by the guillotine. But just before he was beheaded, he said this, "Tell me, after my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." Yeah, can you see why he's number 1 on the list? That is probably one of the creepiest things I have ever heard.
Starting off this morbid list, and at number 10, we have a burning statement. Jose Villegas was convicted of murdering his ex-girlfriend, her son, and her mother 13 years ago, and he was sentenced to be executed. He was also convicted for making terroristic threats to kill women, burglary, and possessing inhalants. His attorney argued that the stabbings weren't intentional because he was mentally ill. Keep in mind that the Supreme Court prohibits the execution of mentally impaired people, but the Supreme Court denied their appeals because they said that previous examinations of Jose Villegas showed showed no mental impairment. And they also argued that his lawyers had 10 years to bring up his mental impairment, but they didn't until just days before his scheduled execution. So as the medical technician inserted the lethal drug, he said, "It does kind of burn. Goodbye." He then gasped several times, his breathing started to get quieter, and within 1 minute, he stopped moving and his pulse stopped. Up next, number 9, we have an unusual statement. Richard Cobb said these last words before he was declared dead. "Wow, this is great. This is awesome. Thank you, Warden." Well, I think it's safe to say that his final statements was very odd. It seems like he actually was enjoying being executed.
Witnesses looking through the glass in a small confined room. He looked calm, looking up at the ceiling.
I expected him to have some remorse, which I didn't. I didn't have any.
The witnesses in the room were left confused and unfulfilled. It's like he did this on purpose because he didn't want the victim's family to get closure. Richard Cobb actually spent a decade on death row for murdering a man who abducted and later killed during a convenience store robbery. After the drug entered his system, his head hit the pillow and his neck twisted with his mouth wide open. 15 minutes later, he was declared dead. Moving up this list, or down this list, depends on how you see it. At number 8, we have Joshua Bishop. During his final moments alive, he said, "I feel it. I don't know about you guys, but the statement gives me the chills. When I was reading Inmates' last words, a lot of them actually say that they feel the drug entering their body and that they can feel that death is near. That is just something so unsettling about the statements that I cannot explain." On the night on June 24th, 1994, he had spent the night drinking and smoking with 2 other people. He tried to steal car keys from Leverett Morrison, who was sleeping at the time, but things didn't go according to plan. Joshua Bishop beat Leverett Morrison to death and dumped his body between 2 trash cans and burned his Jeep. He was arrested within 24 hours after the murder, and he quickly confessed and immediately began to show remorse. However, after the trial, he was convicted and sentenced to die by lethal injection. His lawyers tried to appeal this decision by saying that he is a reformed man and he has turned all of a sudden somehow into a model citizen. They even submitted written statements by the victim's family saying that they didn't want to have him executed, but all of the appeals were denied. A hellish statement makes its way onto this list at number 7. Lavinia Fisher said, "If you have a message and want to get it to hell, give it to me. I'll carry it." Is this real life right now? Well, I guess she knew exactly where she was heading. It wasn't up. It is argued that she is the first woman serial killer in the United States, and she was arrested and sentenced to death by hanging, but she never actually killed anyone. According to the story, Lavinia and her husband ran an inn just outside of Charleston. When a single person checked in, Lavinia would use her charm to gain their trust. Once they felt at ease with her, she would give them a cup of tea that was poisoned. Once the poison entered their body, the person would go to sleep and she would steal their possessions. It was actually her husband that did the stabbings, but as it turns out, she was arrested and hanged in 1820, and it is believed that her spirit still haunts the old city jail. Up next, number 6, we have James Jackson. Before he was executed, he said, "See you all on the other side. Warden murdered me. I am ready to roll. Time to get this party started." James Jackson was not a model citizen, that's for sure. He was a white supremacist who stabbed a 66-year-old black man to death with a sword in New York. He was quickly charged with second-degree murder as a hate crime, and when he was arrested, he told police that he hated black men for at least the past 10 years.
But Jackson allegedly told detectives he had bigger plans. Mr. Jackson regarded the killing as practice prior to going to Times Square to kill additional black men.
He was motivated by his strong hatred, and he fully intended on killing as many black men as he could. Well, thankfully he was caught and arrested before he was able to cause any more harm. Number 5 brings us over to George Harris, who made a disturbing last statement. He said, "Somebody needs to kill my trial attorney." After he won $500 on a craps game in Kansas, he exchanged his winnings for 2 machine guns, and then he had another man hold on to them for safekeeping. But when George Harris came back for his Later that night, the man told them that he didn't know where they were, so he shot them dead with a revolver. There was just so many questions left unanswered, like why does one person need 2 machine guns, and who misplaced the deadly weapons? This is all very strange, but George Harris was eventually sentenced to death by lethal injection on September 13th, 2000, and apparently he wasn't happy with his lawyer's performance during the trial. Stephen Woods creeps onto this list at number 4. He was sentenced to the death penalty in Texas after a jury convicted him of capital murders of several drug dealers, even though someone else confessed to the killings. But Texas has an unusual law that allows the defendant to be put to death for a murder that someone else committed. He was given a lethal injection, but before he died, he said these final last words. "You're not about to witness an execution, you're about to witness a murder. I am strapped down for something that Marcus Rhodes did." After his final statement, he took several deep breaths before he stopped moving completely. Can you imagine being killed for a crime that you didn't directly commit? Yes, he was present during the murders, but he never actually killed anyone. Do you guys agree with the death penalty, or do you guys think that it's cruel and an unusual punishment? What if you never killed anyone, but you were still a part of it? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, because I'm really curious. And now number 3, we're going to be talking about Jonathan Green's last words before death. This inmate used his last breath to maintain his innocence of the murder of a 12-year-old girl. He was arrested for abduction, sexual abuse, and strangulation of a girl whose body was found at his home. His lawyer made several last-ditch efforts to have his death sentence reversed, but none of them were successful. Before he was given the lethal injection, the warden asked him if he had any last words, but he shook his head and said no. But just a few seconds later, he changed his mind and said, "I'm an innocent man. I never killed anyone. Y'all are killing an innocent man." I know that these last words are probably said a lot, but what if they weren't lying? What if they really were innocent? Now that we have better resources and more forensic analysis, it is believed that at least 4.1% of death row inmates would have been exonerated because this DNA evidence wasn't available to them at the time of their conviction. They were given the death penalty when they were actually innocent. We have another chilling statement coming in at number 2. Christina Marie Riggs was a single mother to 5-year-old Justin and 2-year-old Shelby. On the outside, it looked like they were a beautiful family, but Christina Riggs had a dark secret. She was miserable and insecure. She complained about not having enough money to get by. That's when on November 4th of 1997, she did the unthinkable. She gave her son and daughter antidepressants in a cup in order to sedate them, and she injected her son with potassium chloride to put him to sleep. When that didn't work, she smothered them with a pillow. She wrote suicide notes before she attempted to overdose on antidepressants. However, her suicide attempt failed, and she was found guilty and sentenced to death. Before her execution, she said, "There is no way words can express how sorry I am taking the lives of my babies. Now I can be with my as I always intended." She was executed by lethal injection with potassium chloride, which is the same heart-stopping drug she attempted to use on her. And finally, number 1, we have Benny Demps. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection for murdering another inmate before he was killed. He blamed his executioners of butchering him with a needle. He said, "They butchered me back there. I was in a lot of pain. They cut me in the groin. They cut me in the leg. I was bleeding profusely." I'm not really sure what this guy is complaining about because they were about to kill him. Why does he care about anything at this time? So he also said, "This is not an execution. It is a murder." Apparently the medical technicians cut him several times as they were trying to insert the IV, and because he was just an inmate, they didn't treat him with any dignity or respect. Although he was a convicted murderer, and I don't know, I guess this is up for debate. What do you guys think? Do convicts who are about to be put to sleep, for a crime they committed, should they be treated right? Should they be treated the right way? I don't know. I don't think so. Well, this man is about to die anyway. Is he suffering enough? Should he be treated fairly as a human being up until death? So for his last meal, he ordered barbecue chicken, and beef, french fries, salads, Spanish rice, cherry vanilla, and butter pecan ice cream. In at number 10 with Gary Gilmore. During a robbery, Gilmore shot a man twice in the head, even though he was cooperating with his demand. The next day, he attempted to rob a motel, and he ended up fatally shooting the manager in the head. He confessed to the police that he killed 2 people in cold blood, but he was only tried for one of the murders because there wasn't enough physical evidence against him for the other murder. I mean, what the heck? If someone admits to a crime, isn't that enough? Well, the judge sentenced him to a death penalty, and he had a choice of being executed by hanging or shot by a firing squad. I guess he's a fan of irony because he chose to get killed by a firing squad. And his infamous last words were, "Let's do it." Those definitely wouldn't be my final words. I'd probably be screaming. I think Nike must have been inspired by his final last words. Let's do it. Climbing up this list, and at number 9, we're talking about Erskine Childers. Now, I know what you guys must be thinking. Everyone on this list must have committed a horrible crime in order to get the death penalty. Well, he might be our one exception to this rule. Childers was actually an Irish author who wrote a lot of successful novels, but he also had a little bit of a dark side. He would smuggle into Ireland with his sailing yacht until he was caught and sentenced to death. I mean, this seems pretty harsh, but this was during the late 1800s. But what makes things even worse, he filed an appeal and it was pending when they executed him, which is highly illegal today. So before he was executed by a firing squad, he said, "Take a step forward, lads. It will be easier that way." I don't blame him for being bitter. I think this was a pretty cruel and unusual punishment for his crime. Number 8, we have Jimmy Glass, who said, "I'd rather be fishing." Yeah, no shit. I think I'd rather be in a cave of sleeping grizzly bears or at a One Direction concert than be on the chopping block about to die. It's like Jimmy doesn't really give a shit that he's about to die. I think he must have come to terms with his death because those definitely aren't inspiring or moving last words. I wonder what he picked to be engraved on his tombstone. "I'd rather be alive." But before you start feeling sorry for him, just know that he was a convicted murderer, so he had it coming. John Avalos Alba brings us to number 7. He was handed down the death penalty for fatally shooting his wife while he was out on bail for a charge. He was finally executed by lethal injection on May 25th, 2010. I bet the judge who set his bail was feeling really guilty for not setting it higher. So for his final statement on Earth, he said this airy line. "Okay, Warden, let's do it. I love ya. I can taste it already. I'm starting to go." I mean, that just gives me chills. I read that you can feel the cold rush of the lethal injection piercing through your veins. Probably the worst feeling ever. And of course, it's the last feeling ever. I don't know whether or not that's true, but I guess I don't care to know. And now, in at our number 6 spot, we have a really odd last words. James French was a convicted murderer, and he was actually the last person to be executed under Oklahoma's death penalty. He was a pretty violent man. He was already convicted to life in prison for murdering a man who had picked him up from hitchhiking, but he had the desire to die, so that's when he brutally murdered his cellmate in order to get the death penalty. As soon as he was prepped to be executed by the electric chair, he came up with these infamous last words. How's this for a headline? French fries. Do you guys get it? His last name was French, and he was about to get fried by the electric chair. I know I shouldn't be laughing, but it's a little clever. From one scary but clever final statement to another, and at number 5 is George Apple. He said, "Well, gentlemen, you are about to see a baked apple." I would like to think I was given the opportunity for a final statement. I would say something clever like this, but it's also pretty morbid if you think about it. So actually, maybe I would use the opportunity to say something wise. Well, thankfully, I don't really have to think about it because I don't intend to ever be on death row. But anyways, George Apple was originally sentenced to death for committing an evil murder, so I guess he had it coming. Now number 4 brings us to John Rook. In 1980, he kidnapped a 25-year-old nurse in a parking lot where she worked. She was taken to an empty field where she was and murdered by Rook. After the killing, he ran her body over with his car. I mean, wow, was that even necessary? After he was sentenced to death, he made several appeals, but they all failed. So on the day of his execution, he said, "Freedom! Freedom at last!" It's been a good one. Well, I hope you enjoy your freedom, and I'm glad you won't be able to hurt anyone ever again. Tory Twain McNabb takes us to number 3 on our list. He was executed by lethal injection for killing a police officer back in 1997. His lawyers attempted to make an appeal stating that the state's execution methods was cruel and unusual, but the judge was pretty firm and declined their appeals. So during his final minutes, he said, "Mom, sis, look at my eyes. I got no tears. I am unafraid. To the state of Alabama, I hate you. I hate you. I hate you." And as the procedure began, he raised his middle finger to the police officers, and he actually died in that position. I mean, wow, what an honorable way to go. Not. And now at number 2 is Carlos Granados. During a heated argument with his girlfriend, he grabbed a large kitchen knife and stabbed her son. I mean, whoa, talk about anger management issues. And he also stabbed his girlfriend 30 times, but she survived and was able to testify against him in court. For his final meal, he requested fried chicken, pizza, and a soft drink. And right before he was given the lethal injection, he said, "Kathy, you know I never meant to hurt you. I gave you everything, and that's what made me so angry. But I never meant to hurt you. I'm sorry." Well, I think it's a little bit too late for an apology. I hope she didn't even show up to his execution. Topping off this morbid list, and at number 1, we have Peter Manuel. He is actually known as Scotland's worst serial killer ever. He was convicted of murdering a total of 7 people between the years of 1956 and 1958, but it is believed that he killed many more people. He was hanged at Glasgow's Barlinnie prison, and he was one of the last people to have ever been executed in these gallows ever since the death penalty was overturned. But before he stepped out to his death, he said, "Turn up the radio and I'll go quietly." There's just something about that statement that gives me the chills. Starting things off, number 10, we have Robert Elton Harris. He said, "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everyone dances with the Grim Reaper." He was arrested on July 5th of 1978 when him and his brother hijacked a car with 2 boys in it. They ordered them to drive to a remote location where their brothers brutally murdered them, and then they used the vehicle as a getaway car when they robbed a San Diego bank. Robert Harris was arrested just 1 hour after the robbery, and he was charged with murder and auto theft, kidnapping, burglary, and bank robbery. One of the arresting officers was the father of one of the murdered boys, but he didn't realize that the victim was his son until later. He wasn't even able to recognize his son's face. That's how violent the murder was. Robert Harris was sentenced to death in 1979. After many appeals, he was finally executed in San Quentin's gas chamber on April 21st of 1992. Moving up this list with George Engel in at number 9. He was an anarchist who didn't like to follow any sort of rules or regulations. He was involved with a lot of activism and protests in the Chicago area. A protest bombing took place in Haymarket Square in Chicago that resulted in the death of 7 police officers, 4 civilians, and a lot of other people who were seriously injured. George Engel was actually at home playing cards while this riot broke out, and he was arrested the next day and charged with conspiracy in the bombings. He was convicted and sentenced to hanging, but before he took his last breath, he said, "Hurrah for anarchy. This is the happiest moment of my life." Roger Keith Coleman makes his last statement in at number 8. His case gained nationwide attention and major controversy because he maintained his innocence the whole time during his conviction and even right before he was executed. During his final last words, he said, "An innocent man is going to be murdered tonight. When my innocence is proven, I hope Americans will realize the injustice of the death penalty as all other civilized countries have." He was convicted in Virginia for assaulting and murdering his sister-in-law on the day that he has been laid off from work. After his death, the DNA evidence was reanalyzed, and in January 2006, the governor announced that the testing of the DNA evidence has conclusively proven that he was guilty of the crime. Okay, that's great and all, but why don't you think you should have done 1,000 tests on the DNA before you executed him? It makes no sense. What if the DNA evidence proved that he wasn't guilty? What would the press conference look like then? Oops, we made a massive mistake and killed an innocent man. My bad. And now at number 7, we have Timothy McVeigh. He infamously said, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." If you guys remember, he was the one behind the Oklahoma City bombing, which killed 168 people and injured over 680 others. This is actually the deadliest act of domestic in the United States. His execution date was set for June 11, 2001, and he made a request to have it publicly televised, but this motion was denied. He invited a composer to perform classical music on the night of his execution, and he requested to have a Catholic chaplain. He also requested 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream as his last meal. He was executed by lethal injection, and his wait to be executed was way shorter than most inmates waiting on death row. He only spent about 4 years on death row, while most inmates spend an average of 15 years. The infamous Jeffrey Dahmer is next up at number 6. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms for murdering 17 men in the Milwaukee area, and this is between 1978 and 1991. He was also heavily into and he kept his victims' body parts in the freezer so that he can just eat them later. The interesting part of this story is that Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't given the death penalty. His inmate actually beat him to death because he said that Jeffrey Dahmer was a sick and creepy man. And yeah, he was. He used to make this person food look like human body parts, and he would cover them in ketchup to resemble blood. So according to Jeffrey Dahmer's murderer, his last words were, "I don't care if I live or die, go ahead and kill me." And now at number 5 we have Tom Blackjack Ketchum. He was an outlawed cowboy who murdered someone in 1895. After that, his gang fled to New Mexico, where they committed more robberies before he was captured during an unsuccessful attempt to rob a train. He was quickly arrested, put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to death by hanging. When his execution date arrived, it was the biggest public display in the area because he was the first person to be hanged for a train robbery in New Mexico. However, things didn't go as smoothly as they hoped. Before he was hanged, he said this, "I'll be in hell before you start breakfast, boys, let her rip." And right after that, he said the rope completely decapitated him, and it is said that his headless body landed on its feet and stayed standing upright for quite some time. John Wayne Gacy had 3 famous last words, and this comes into number 4. He kept it short and sweet when he said, "Kiss my ass." I don't know about you guys, but I think I would have, a lot more to say for my final words than "kiss my ass." But then again, he was a textbook serial killer who didn't really have any emotions. He was known as the Killer Clown because he used to dress up as Pogo the Clown and perform at many charitable events and birthday parties. He took the lives of at least 33 boys in Illinois, and he would bury their bodies underneath his home. So when he was convicted of sexual assault in 1968, the police were able to find all of the dead bodies that he tried to cover up. Despite a bunch of corpses being found underneath his own home, he maintained his innocence. But he was found guilty in 1980 because there was just so much compelling evidence against him. He was given multiple death penalties and life sentences, and finally, after being on death row for 14 years, he was executed by lethal injection. Aileen Whornos is up next at number 3. Aileen had a terrible childhood that was full of and abandonment, so it's almost no surprise that she went on a killing rampage that would define her as America's most infamous female serial killer. She worked as a prostitute, and she killed 7 men that picked her up along the highway. Aileen said that all of her murderers were out of self-defense, but she was also convicted and sentenced to death for 6 of the murders. She was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002, but before she died, she said this, "I just like to say, I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June the 6th. Like the movie, a big mothership of all, I'll be back." I don't even know what this even means, but I am pretty scared. And June 6th. What happens on June 6th? Carl Panzram's last words makes it onto this list at number 2. You probably don't recognize his name, but he is actually known as one of the most sadistic American serial killers of all time. He had more than a dozen aliases, and no one knew anything about what he has done for years until he was captured in November 1928. Before his death, he confessed to killing 21 people and brutally harming 1,000 males. Is this real life right now? And right before he was hanged, he said, "In my lifetime, I have murdered 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I have committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings." That is just sickening, and for all those reasons, I'm not the least bit sorry for this guy. The Vampire of Dusseldorf falls onto our list at number 1. He is known as a vampire because he would occasionally attempt to drink the blood from his victims' wounds while they were still alive. But eventually he was arrested and sentenced to death by beheading because he committed a series of murders and assaults. He even admitted to killing a 9-year-old girl. It is confirmed that he murdered at least 9 people, but the police suspected that he brutally murdered a lot more people. So one evening before his death, he ordered a Wiener Schnitzel, a bottle of white wine, and fried potatoes, and the next morning he was taken to the guillotine to have his head chopped off. But before he left this world, he made one last scary statement that probably haunted the people that were at his execution. He said, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my head? That would be a pleasure to end all pleasures." I mean, yeah, after hearing that, I'm definitely gonna have nightmares, and if that wasn't enough, his mummified head is on display right now in a Wisconsin museum after doctors tried to cut it open to find reasons behind his evil. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
Starting off this countdown, we have the Russian girl. This message was written by a Russian girl named Vala Barin. Her and her husband were caught and jailed by the secret police of Nazi Germany. The final messages that she left on her cell wall were heartbreaking. This is what she wrote, and I quote, "Here was held in custody Vala Barin, who was betrayed by her own Russian compatriots. My husband and I were both put away in one cell. Another 3 Russian civilians and 1 prisoner of war were in the same cell. They had pistols. We will be facing the gallows. My only regret is to be separated from the beloved husband and the whole wide world." This message really displays the horrors of that time. An innocent woman and her husband locked away, just waiting for their turn to be hung. It really is quite terrifying. In our 9th spot today, we have the Watchful Eye. This next piece of graffiti was found in the abandoned West Virginia penitentiary. It says, "I'm watching you, Freddy-O." Now, I don't know who Freddy-O is, and I don't really want to know, but I feel bad for them. That is absolutely terrifying. Someone was keeping a watchful eye on him. The eye itself also just looks horrifying, like it's staring right into my soul. Ooh. Moving on to number 8, we have Aaron Hernandez. Aaron Hernandez was an American football player in the NFL for 3 seasons. However, in 2013, he was arrested for the death of his friend, Odin Lloyd. In the end, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. But in 2017, Aaron took his life in jail. Before doing so, he apparently cut his finger and wrote John 3:16 on the wall in his own blood. He also wrote it on his forehead as well. John 3:16 said that God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall never die, but have eternal life. Not only that, but another report said that he drew an unfinished pyramid with the all-seeing eye on the wall as well, which is hella creepy. Like, why did he do that? What is this supposed to mean? I'm creeped out. In our 7th spot today, we have Welcome Home. This next message was captured by photographer Mark Perot. He got a tour of Eastern State Penitentiary, and he was just going there to capture the empty building and the abandoned rooms. But while there, he found a deeper connection to the graffiti on the prison cell walls. So he started to photograph that instead. In one cell, a prisoner left a very creepy, welcoming message. It says, "Welcome home, convict." Now, we're not sure if the person who wrote the message was freed or ended up dying in jail, but we do know that that was one of his final messages. And it was to the person who would be taking over his room. But it's not really a warm welcoming if you ask me. Coming in at number 6, we have the hanging tree. This next message left by a prisoner is fairly dark. Basically, the prisoner drew himself being hung from a tree. The words, "This is my family tree," are written by it with arrows. Clearly, this message has a deeper meaning. One can interpret that he meant his family tree, or family bloodline, ends after his death, We can assume he never had kids, so after his death, that's the end of their family name. I guess he has no other siblings or living relatives, which is dark as hell. This prisoner was later found in his room dead. He hung himself with his bedsheet. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the gallows. In 2014, a jail in Windsor was allowing visitors to come in and go on guided tours. This, of course, was after the prison was decommissioned and the inmates were moved to another prison. Now, this prison is eerie for a number of reasons. Number one, the jail had a built-in gallows, which they used up until the death penalty was removed in 1976. But before that, they were hanging prisoners right there in the very prison. To this day, the trapdoor as well as the bolts where the ropes used to hang are still visible. Not only that, but the cells are filled with scary graffiti. The government has since tried to get this graffiti removed, but this is pretty creepy. This was the last message written by an inmate before he got moved to the new facility. It says, "We are moving southwest, so don't hang around." The end. Obviously, hang was a play on words. Just knowing the history of that prison makes that message that much more darker. In our 4th spot today, we have the hit list. For this one, let's take a trip to Bogo Road Jail in Australia. So this jail had a strict set of rules. Prisoners were not allowed to write on or deface their cell walls. Any graffiti that was spotted was quickly removed. But in 1989, they started to let this slide since the jail was facing closure. This was one of the eerie messages they found in one of the cells. This is the list of prison officers that worked at this jail. It was written as a threat to scare the officers that the inmates didn't like. It was also meant to scare any new officers coming in. Kind of like, you're next. I don't know about you, but if I walked in and saw my name on that list and knew that they were coming after me, I'd walk right back out. Moving on, at number 3, we have the dead man's. This eerie message was left by a prisoner who was on death row. It was hard to find a lot of information on him, but basically he was put on death row after being convicted of killing a man after they found his fingerprints on the murder weapon. But according to the prisoner, he was never able to tell his full side of the story. He never confessed and always maintained that he was innocent. He did witness the murder of his friend and made the mistake of picking up the murder weapon, but he had nothing to do with the actual murder. That's what he was trying to get at with this final message. Moving on, at number 2, we have the bloodbath. This next creepy message was left in the showers of a now abandoned prison. Clearly, someone didn't like what another prisoner was doing and left this message as a warning. It says, "This is what will happen next time. Bloodbath." Isn't that just great? I hope no one ever crossed this prisoner again. I would hate to see the outcome of that. And in the number 1 spot today, we have the Craigslist Killer. Philip Markoff, better known as the Craigslist Killer, is responsible for taking the life of Jalissa Brisman on April 14th, 2009. Markoff got his name because he would go on Craigslist and respond to sexual ads, meet up with them before attacking and robbing them. He received immense gratification from doing so, but in the end, he was caught. His final words were directed to his fiancée, Megan, who he had given the nickname Pocket to. On August 15th, 2010, Markoff took his own life in his cell. As he was bleeding out, he left one final message in blood. He wrote Megan's name along with Pocket on the wall. The words he wrote itself aren't scary, but it's the fact that he wrote this when he was bleeding out and dying. In fact, Markoff made sure he wasn't going to come back from this. Officers found toilet paper shoved down his throat so that they couldn't resuscitate him.
Number 10, Jason Brian Dalton. Some people think that demons and possession usually happens at a crossroads or maybe even with a Ouija board, but this is the 21st century. Jason Brian Dalton blamed it on his phone. He was an Uber driver, and on the evening of February 20th, he used a weapon to take the lives of multiple people. Dalton said that when he opened up the Uber app, he was presented with the symbol of the Eastern Star, which represents God on Earth. But apparently it wasn't God communicating with him through the phone, as he says that an image of the devil's head appeared on his screen, which he describes as looking like a cow with horns. He said that from that night he could barely remember anything, except that the devil would apparently tell him where to go and whose lives to take, saying that it was like the devil completely took over his body and mind. Then when police apprehended him, he said that the screen on his phone went from black to red and that the devil was no longer in control after that point. Number 9. Arnie Johnson. It's impossible to go through any discussion about this topic without talking about this one specific case, and I'm sure you were all expecting to hear it, so let's get it out of the way. In 1981, a man named Arnie Johnson killed his landlord, and the events went on to inspire the movie The Conjuring: The Devil Made Me Do It. Before the night of the crime, Arnie's fiance's brother appeared to become possessed by the devil, speaking in strange languages and his eyes turning black, among other things. As time went on, Arnie would start taunting the demon, telling him to leave the brother alone and take him instead. He then went to investigate a spooky well and supposedly saw a demon, who took over his body and committed the crime. When he went on trial, his team pleaded not guilty by reason of demonic possession. A pretty bold move. Of course, the judge didn't accept this and Arnie was sentenced, only ending up serving about 5 years before he was released and married his fiancée. Number 8. Pazuzu Algarad. In North Carolina, a man going by the name of Pazuzu Algarad was arrested after it was discovered he had been burying bodies of his victims. He had taken on the name Pazuzu in reference to the demon from The Exorcist, and had even undergone some strange body modification, making his tongue forked and sharpening his teeth. If that's already not weird enough for you, the man who was at the property when the bodies were discovered had a lot to say about Algarad. He said that the man was possessed by demons and that they would take over his body about once a month, usually around a full moon. He described it as being very serpentine and said that the man's eyes would get glazy, saying it was like the inner part of the man would fade away. And he also said that Algarad would sacrifice animals once a month. The interior of the home was also terrifying, as the walls were apparently covered in graffiti and dark symbols, and the building was deemed unsafe for human life. Number 7. Pamela Frenette. In Norfolk, Virginia, 2 police officers were called to the scene after receiving reports of a man screaming and yelling in the street, and it didn't end when they got there. The man apparently swore at the police and assaulted them, even biting one of the officers on the hand. Pretty strange, but I'm sure we've all bitten someone at some point, right? Well, it gets just a little bit weirder. A woman named Pamela Frenette is apparently the wife of the man who had attacked the officers, and had apparently been begging them not to hurt him despite his actions. She said that her husband hadn't been in his right mind because he had been possessed by a demon. Pamela said that she had even managed to catch the demon on camera and knew that it had possessed her husband, saying, "I caught it on camera, a demon, it really was, so I figured that's what got him." Unfortunately, I couldn't really find much more information on this other than the original report, so we may never know just what Pamela actually saw that day. Number 6. Tommy Smith. In February of 2015, a young man named Tommy Smith saw a car that he wanted, and he wanted it bad. Instead of, say, saving up money and purchasing it, he instead decided to steal the keys from the 65-year-old man driving the car. But when the man wouldn't give in, Smith got angry, attacking him with a weapon so aggressively that he even managed to snap it in half. Fortunately, the elderly man was able to survive but suffered serious physical and mental damage as a result. When Smith went on trial for the attack, he said that he had started suffering from hallucinations a few weeks before the crime took place, and had actually been possessed by a demon at the time of the attack. Similar to Arnie Johnson, the court didn't want to hear it and noted the young man's history of schizophrenia. He ended up being charged but didn't go to jail, instead being sent to a mental hospital until they saw fit for him to be released. Number 5. David Berkowitz. Throughout the 1970s, a man named David Berkowitz terrorized New York City. After already becoming a serial arsonist, he apparently started to hear the voices of demons in his head telling him to commit crimes. When he moved to a new home, he started to believe that his neighbors and their dogs were possessed by demons. And when he moved to a new apartment in the same area, his neighbor was a retiree named Sam, who he believed was a powerful demon. Sam's dog named Harvey was also apparently a demon, and Berkowitz believed that the dog was telling him to kill. His neighbor's name of Sam is also how he got his later name, which was Son of Sam. Soon after, people were turning up dead and police were trying to figure out who it was. During a break from the crimes, Berkowitz wrote a note to the New York Post that said, "I am still here like a spirit roaming the night, thirsty, hungry, seldom stopping to rest." He was eventually caught for the crimes and received a whopping 365 years in prison, where he apparently apparently became a born-again Christian. Number 4. Nikolai Golubiak. Of course, things like this don't just happen in America, so let's head over to Russia in August of 2008. In a forest outside of a Russian town, 4 bodies were discovered, all seemingly having gone through something pretty terrible. It turned out that the crime had been committed by 6 self-proclaimed Satanists, the group being led by a man named Nikolai. They believed that human sacrifices were required to please Lucifer, or the devil, and the crime had been a part of an initiation ritual. The bodies had been discovered only 250 meters from Nikolai's own home, and one of the bodies had a sheet of paper that contained 101 rules of the Satanists. The young man received 20 years in prison, while the rest of the members of the group received various different charges ranging from 8 to 10 years. This isn't the first time that a crime has been committed for the sake of a ritual or cult, and it certainly won't be the last. Number 3. Cody Lott. Over the years, men have been known to do crazy things over unrequited love, and this story is especially tragic. 2 young women were walking down a footpath in September of 2016 when they were approached by a man in a car. That man was named Cody Lott. He then attacked both the girls with a weapon, only one of them surviving the event. At his trial that took place 2 years later in 2018, Lott claimed that he had actually spoken with the devil, and that the devil had even helped him to plan the attack, saying it was due to one of the girls having a boyfriend and his own frustration over not having been able to find a romantic partner. Due to these claims, he was found mentally unfit to stand trial and sent to the maximum security unit of a Texas mental hospital. After he was released and was able to stand trial, he was sentenced to life in prison. Oddly, his parents then sued the state of Wichita to get the weapon used in the crime back, saying it had been stolen from their apartment, so I guess it was pretty important to them. Number 2. Louis Zambrano. On September 10th, 2015, in Queens, New York, a body was discovered. It was the body of Angie Escobar, who had apparently died after being attacked with a pair of scissors, reportedly having been there for about 4 days before she was found. Police were quick to find a suspect, arresting the woman's short-term boyfriend, Louis Zambrano, who had attempted to run away to Virginia. When put on trial, he claimed that he had 2 reasons for the attack. 1, demonic possession, and number 2, trust issues. One of these things is not like the other. Everyone who heard his declaration was disgusted, both the victim's family and the judge calling him out on his ridiculous claim, believing he was clearly using it as a poor excuse. He was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison, also receiving an extra 3 years for an unrelated burglary charge. And I wonder if that one was the devil's fault too. Number 1. Michael Taylor. A lot of people think that exorcisms are a thing of the past, but they're most definitely not. The Archdiocese of Indianapolis reportedly receiving around 1,700 exorcism requests in the year of 2018 alone. Back in 1974, an exorcism took place in England, the possessed man being Michael Taylor. He had joined a church and allegedly started having an affair with the congregation leader, Marie Robinson. During the time they spent together, Taylor went from a seemingly happy man to a more angry and irritable one, until eventually the two were caught naked together and Taylor blamed it on an evil presence or demon that was within him. A vicar was called in to perform an exorcism on him, and in October of that year, they reportedly expelled a whopping 40 demons from his body. Despite them believing that there were still 3 evil demons inside him, they let him go on his way. And only a few years later, he was found covered in blood, and he said it was the blood of Satan himself. Well, it was actually the blood of his wife, him having taken her life. Taylor was put on trial but was found not guilty due to reason of insanity.